I'll begin by saying that was a great session. It was so energetic. I couldn't believe it. I asked to sit here because I was planning to see the screen. I would like to thank, first of all, Desenvolvimento, I'll say it in Portuguese, Desenvolvimento em Paz, for inviting me. Over these years, I've come to know development and peace, and it seems to be so much in tune with the nature and manner of operating of the Pastoral Land Commission that I feel very much at home. I was asked to speak on living the church of the poor. And I had the privilege years ago of being part of the pastoral team of the prelacy of São Félix do Araguaia, whose bishop was Pedro Casaldáliga. And I'm presently reading his journal from the 80s, and I came across this passage, which I thought was very interesting to be aware of this fact. Not judging history is like not reading it rationally. It is no longer the master of life. The story that is told or written is always subjective because it is interpretation. Its objectivity lies in the historian's honesty, but the interpretation will always depend on the social place in which the historian is situated. A photograph depends on the perspective in which it is taken. Click. As you probably could guess by the color of my hair, I'm a contemporary of Cardinal Czerny. So I, too, looking at my own history, recall many of the facts that he shared. In 1965, as the Vatican Council closed, Pope Paul participated in Vatican II and was there for the closing. And the last document that came out was Gaudium et Spes. And this passage has stayed with me ever since. The joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the men of this age, this was before gender awareness, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. This same Paul VI wrote his encyclical Popularum Progressio in 1967, which is a founding document for you. Soon after, the next year, he opened the Episcopal Conference of Latin American Bishops in Medellin. And 3 years later, the World Synod of Bishops on Justice in the World. All of these, if you click again. Click. There we go. Seem to follow the same thread throughout them. From Popularum Progressio, development is the new word for peace. Peace cannot be seen simply as the absence of war. It must be built daily, and it must strive towards a more perfect justice among human beings. The bishops in Latin America said, the Latin American episcopate cannot remain indifferent to the tremendous social injustices existing in Latin America, which keep the majority of our peoples in painful poverty. And then we got more explicit yet in the Synod of Bishops in 1971. Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel. Click. That adds a little something. I joined the Sisters of St. Joseph. I was already a member, but I went to Brazil in 1976. At that time, the church offered a 4-month course for foreign missionaries that had quite a bit on social, political reality, theology, and ecclesiology, which was right after Medellin, so you can imagine. Stress on the Church of the Poor and the theology of liberation. From there, I went to the state of Goiás, where I lived among the rural poor between 77 and 82. During that time, I read a book by Leonardo Boff called Faith on the Periphery of the World. And in that, he invited us to a word that became very popular in the church in those years called insertion, which translated as an encouragement to change your social place. In other words, to change the reference. Where is the social place that's important to you in the way that you live? Okay? Click. So when I arrived to join the sisters, soon after Medellin, this was going on. The church was beginning to produce these little booklets, 25 pages or less, that would have illustrations, short texts, and always a reference to the Bible in the midst of it. And I remember, I was just so fascinated. There was a whole series on the history of the people of God. The people that, as they read it in these sessions, was like they automatically identified with those people. There was no like, can you see a comparison? It was just automatic. So that when you say, we would read the text, I heard the cry of the people and I came to set them free. It was like an immediate comprehension of that message. Click. In 1975, bishops of the Amazon region requested that the Conference of Bishops convoke an encounter. And at that meeting, they decided, after looking at the social reality, that they wanted to create a special commission with a pastoral character that would focus to be a pastoral presence among the rural workers, particularly those suffering violence and slave labor, and to provide qualified assistance in their efforts to organize. I joined the CPT in 1981, 41 years ago. And 2 years later, I joined the pastoral team of the Prelacy of São Félix do Araguaia. The man in the blue shirt is Pedro Casaldáliga, who was one of the founders of the CPT. So what I began to know a couple years before, I lived more fully in my years in the Prelacy, my 22 years. Click. During those times, both in the south of Goiás, where I was before, and in the Prelacy of São Félix in the state of Mato Grosso, we encouraged the creation of SEBIs, the base communities, ecclesial-based communities. And the method that the bishops used at Medellin became the method that we used in those little booklets that we used when we gathered the communities for study and discussion. And they had 3 steps called ver, to see, julgar, to judge, and agir, to act. So to first look at the social reality, then discuss the options in the light of the gospel, and finally to act accordingly. Parallel to that, the CPT and the Prelazia, where I was working and living at the time, we followed and incorporated Paulo Freire's method of popular education, where he advised against banking method, where some give all the information, the others just passively received. And he said, no, the relationship should be one of an exchange of knowledge, so that I know, and you know, and we all learn. Click. During those years, part of the process, both in the south of Goiás and in the Prelazia of São Félix, was very much marked by our living among the people we served. That personal contact that Pope talks about, encounter, was really what changed my life and many others. Okay, click. As I read the material that was sent to me ahead of time, I saw so many similarities between the CPT and the NDNP. First of all, our mission and identity, inspired both by Gaudium et Spes and Popularum Progressio, seeing the people of God and encouraging that they be engaged in social action to transform unjust structures. Both organizations have hundreds of volunteers who give freely of their time and energy to carry out the mission in their own particular context. And who work with them, dedicated staff who work both internally with the volunteers at the grassroots in Brazil, together with the rural communities, as well as externally networking with social movements to bring about social change. Click. I was moved last night by the vision statement that was read, and it reminded me of an encounter that we had in 2001, in which those of us pastoral agents who had been in the CPT for 10 years or more gathered for 4 or 5 days to discuss where we were at, what was happening in Brazil, and we ended up by renewing our mission statement. So it's a two-part. And the first part I share with you is this, that the CPT reaffirms its pastoral character and resumes with renewed vigor the grassroots work with peoples of the land and water through presence, promotion, support, accompaniment, and advice. The CPT over the years had begun to contract technical people, agronomists, lawyers, and felt that it needed to reaffirm its pastoral identity as well. And that what made all the difference in the work of the CPT is the word that's called in Portuguese, convivência. But Google only gave me coexistence, which is far from it. I use the word presence, but it's really living among. So it's relationship, again, very much what Pope Francis talks about in Fratelli Tutti. In that same session, we said that the way that we would try to affect this work is to respect the people in their collective processes, the conquest of the rights and of land, their resistance on the land, and sustainable production. Also, in publicizing their victories and their struggles against injustices. The CPT, from the very beginning, it was created in June, and its first mimeographed newsletter came out in December of the same year. and finally seeking to involve the entire Christian community and society in the struggle for land and on the land. Click. Again, living among, knowing these people by name, seeing their struggles makes all the difference in the way we grew to be the pastoral agents that we became. And we grew to become the sisters, the religious we became as well. Click. The mission statement elaborated at that same encounter was the synthesis of the work in different groups, and each word was defended by the groups that participated in the encounter. And each one is loaded, so we'll take it slowly. Convoked by the subversive memory of the gospel of life and hope. Faithful to the God of the poor, to the land of God and the poor of the land. Listening to the cries that rise from the fields and forests. Following the practice of Jesus. CPT strives to be a solidary, prophetic, ecumenical, fraternal, and affective presence, which provides an educational and transformative service to the peoples of the land and waters. For what purpose? This is a clincher here, which is hard. CPT attracts a lot of people with a very militant, activist heart. But our goal, we said, is to stimulate and reinforce their protagonism, that of the organizations, and not to be ourselves center stage. Click. In that process, the CPT gradually encouraged the creation of a number of rural social movements. The first, the Movimento Sem Terra, the landless, in 1984, I think. Then the Movimento de Pequenos Agricultores, which would be small farmers. Then the Movimento dos Atingidos por Barragens, those affected by hydroelectric projects, displaced by hydroelectric projects. And then also the movement of peasant women. Click. Over the years, the CPT has worked together with many partners. And these partners, each one has its own history, its own mission, its own mode of action. Some methodology is closer to ours, and some is more diverse, but we have common goals. Many of them are human rights organizations, but others are more in the field of agriculture and ecology and so forth. Click. I noticed in the material that I read in preparation from the synthesis that you had there, some of the comments that I thought were worth repeating. We cannot work for real change without strategic partners because the power of the grassroots base and the organization of local capacities by capable partners are key to influencing civil society. For members, staff, and partners, partnership is a long-term engagement because social transformation takes time. Cultivating leaders and communities takes time. Sustaining communities takes time and support. Our members were clear in phase one that we should work with networks, allies, and coalitions for effective social change in the North and South. Partners reinforced this perspective in their survey, naming the importance of grassroots initiatives and network alliances to amplify the voice of the poor and call on DPCC to reinforce dialogue between North and South. Going back to the first one up there, CPT, I think, is a little bit original in Brazil, in that in one organization, we have approximately 180 employed pastoral workers and almost 500 volunteers scattered in all of the states. Without those volunteers, we would not do what we've done. I was a volunteer most of my years because the volunteers live amongst the people they serve. And some of the contracted professionals that serve a wider area can't live among them because they have to go to different places. So the combination of those who live amongst and know the dynamic and are able to share their observations and recommendations and so forth makes the work, the collective work, much more effective. On the other hand, since its creation, the CPT has had a national secretariat with a communication team and a documentation team. As I mentioned earlier, 6 months after its creation, it released its first mimeographed bulletin through the mail out to the people. And what was in that bulletin were notices of conflicts in different places. Well, soon, the owners of that land, or the pretended owners, began to pressure against the CPT. So very soon, the CPT realized it had to organize the material. Nothing was published that wasn't founded on something that came from the local teams. So they created a documentation department. After 28 years working in grassroots, I moved to Goiânia and collaborated with the National Secretariat, and we ended up digitizing over 320,000 pages of documents, around 280,000 of those were on conflicts over land and water and labor rights. So the CPT, in addition to having all those people at the grassroots, has a qualified team with more than 40 years of accumulated information to defend the position in anything that they write. I should have brought the report. It's in Portuguese. It's in my room. Tomorrow I'll bring it over. Comes out every year. So it's a very unique combination to bring those two parts together. Click. When we talk about the alliances, and it seemed to have been one of the issues that was a difficult thing for you a few years ago, with whom do you network? With whom do you make alliances? And are all partners the same? Of course not. But if we want to bring about social transformation, we can't just stay among our own. So if we're going out into the world, we have to learn to dialogue with people who have common goals and different practices. And it's interesting, some of those partners that we helped create, we were in on getting them started, and eventually they said, "Thank you very much. We'll call you when we want you," which is part of a process of coming to age. And it doesn't mean they are no longer our partners, but they have their history, their goals, and their mission, and we collaborate on common goals. So we participate in many church-related pastoral ministries and organizations, a whole bunch on human rights, more recently, a good number on the environment. Today, unfortunately, the question of agrarian reform, fewer organizations are involved. I didn't put them all, I just put the two main ones, the MASCT, the Landless, and ABITA, the Association of Agrarian Reform in Brazil. And then there's a new one now, the last few years, that is joining groups that are human rights groups, but also looking at the question of the environment and trying to get the European Union to hold companies accountable for the destruction of the environment in Brazil and other Latin American countries. Click. This is the end. The last one goes back to the beginning. I believe we Christians are called to change our social place. That segment of society which is our point of reference. We might move geographically, but not necessarily. It's a call to change social place. What is the part of society that I am most concerned about? And what is your point of reference? Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Jean. I believe we do have some time for questions and to engage. So does anybody have a first question or comment? Yes.
There, Sister Jean. I suppose that you have a lot of problem with your actual president.
Terrible, terrible, terrible. Some people, you know, when he says or does one more terrible thing, it's like, how did this man get elected? But it shows you the power of the media. In the years before the election in 2018, a judge in the state of Paraná began a proceeding against corruption charges, and they included it against the former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and companies that they alleged favored him or that he benefited from the relationship between them. And as a result of that, it went on for several years. The judge and the prosecutors used, not plea bargaining, they have another word for it there, but it's like if you give us a declaration that incriminates somebody else, we'll reduce your sentence. We'll propose a reduction in the reduction of your sentence. So they practically negotiated the declarations that they wanted, and those that didn't say what they wanted didn't get any reduction in their sentences. And after Lula was tried, convicted, stayed in prison for 500 days, the judge was accused of not being impartial, and it was all nullified. But in the meantime, Bolsonaro got elected. And now Bolsonaro and Lula are running for president the end of this year.
Sister Jean, I'm a little bit famous, and Luke has already said this. I'm famous for long questions and long commentary. I'm going to be short. I'm going to ask you, would you please, thanks first of all for your presentation. Thank you so much. Could you share with us a few comments, a few perceptions of your own with respect to MST? And I'm going to weight it by saying a partner that I honor highly.
The landless movement, Movimento Sem Terra, is the most significant social movement in Brazil, responsible for mobilizing many, many people, landless people, who either occupied land that was idle and challenged the federal government to disappropriate that land so that it could fulfill its social function by providing sustenance for these families. That was one way. And then when one of the presidents passed a decree saying that occupied land would not be disappropriated for agrarian reform, they began to organize encampments, usually very close to the land that they were trying to get disappropriated. And some of those encampments lasted for years. And the MST worked very hard at creating a mystique to sustain the hardship that those families faced over those years. And a certain discipline, because, you know, if you're waiting year after year and you're really short on money and so forth, people get, you know, very edgy, and it's easy to have conflicts among them. So it was a very admirable process of how to sustain this movement. With changes in Brazil over the past 5 to 8 years maybe, there has been a shift, partly because of resistance to continuing the practice of disappropriating land for agrarian reform. So they have begun to work on the question. They've always worked on cooperatives and agriculture and trying to raise the income of the families and so forth that they work with. But they worked also during the pandemic. They organized fabulous solidarity movements that provided tons and tons and tons of food baskets for people in cities around the country. Do they do everything just like the CPT would do? No. They have their own practice, their own political stature. They're protagonists, where the CPT says we're supporting actors. So it's a different role, but we are great allies, and they continue to do a very important work. They also do a lot on formation for their youth. Very, very interesting as well.
One more question. Okay.
Thank you, Sister Jean. I have a question about if you can explain us how do you work with the leaders of the community, like communauté ecclésiale de base. Comment vous réussissez à travailler avec les leaders, les gens que vous avez dit quand when you said, when they read the gospel, they say, I am part of those poor. How do you travel? How do you work with the people on the land?
Actually, what I said, I don't know if you remember, one of the earlier images was of a whole bunch of little, looked almost like pamphlets, but they really were like little booklets. Each of them would have an encounter that maybe 3 or 4 pages with an illustration and something like a fact of life, we'd call it, you know, and then a couple of questions about that to get people talking about the reality they were living, and then some biblical reference that would kind of bring them to how the people of God in times past acted in similar situations. And like I said before, I mean, it was just amazing an automatic identification. And a very energizing experience. Just a sense that we are part of that same people of God. They didn't need to have Vatican II to remind them. It was like, that's us. It was really amazing. And also, that model of small communities worked very well in the rural areas. It also worked in the peripheries of the cities, but in the rural areas even better because they were natural communities. So they would come together and reflect, study the Bible, talk about their lives, and it just seemed to kind of all flow together. And it was very vital during the 80s and 90s, and then it dwindled as the charismatic movement began to take over in different places. Well, I remember the years I was in the Prelacy of St. Felix, our songbooks, the pronoun was we and us. And now, in most liturgies, the songs are I and me. And instead of God being amongst us, God is up there again in the seventh heaven. You know, it's a shame how that can change, you know. But there's still the people in the base communities still exist. They don't seem to get as much coverage, and there aren't as many of them, and they aren't as vital. There are a lot of people who were active in base communities years ago who live in cities who feel sort of without any place they can call home, you know. Thank you.